in those instances, it can get messy, because if you're going to bring over just open items, then it looks a bit weird when you're looking at a purchase order in the target system, because it doesn't match the original one, because there's 10 lines on the original PO. When you migrate, there were only 3 that were open. So you're migrating a PO with 3 items on, and they're just the remaining ones that are to be delivered and invoiced. So there are issues with that.
Growing a business requires a holistic approach that extends beyond sales and marketing. This approach needs alignment among people, processes, and technologies. So if you're a business owner, operations, or finance leader looking to learn growth strategies from your peers and competitors, you're tuned into the right podcast. Welcome to the WBS Podcast, where scalable growth using business systems is our #1 priority. Now, here is your host, Sam Gupta.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the WBS Podcast. I'm Sam Gupta, your host and principal consultant at independent ERP and digital transformation consulting firm Elevate IQ. Most people struggle to understand the data migration challenges with ERP systems. They also struggle to understand why ERP data is harder to migrate than other technical systems such as CRM. The challenges could be even more grave if there are multiple currencies involved, as well as when you might be migrating data from incompatible and incomplete source. So what are the best practices of data migration? In today's episode, our guest, Richard Ray, shares his insights into data migration challenges of financial data. He also talks about several issues with data migration projects such as multi-currency, incomplete source data, and incompatibility of source and destination data sources. Finally, we discuss the differences between migrating financial and operational data and the rationale for bringing data and how each system has different ways of handling chart of accounts. Let me introduce Richard to you. Richard is an IT professional with 20 plus years experience specializing in the design, implementation, development, and management of business systems. With that, let's get to the conversation. Hey Richard, welcome to the show.
Hey Sam, thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Of course, my pleasure. And this is going to be so exciting because the kind of depth you have from the perspective in the ERP world, that's always the most challenging area in my experience. So I am personally going to have a lot of fun discussing that. Before we do that, do you want to start with a little personal story and your current focus, Richard?
Okay, yeah, thanks, Sam. So Richard Ray, I'm a business system specialist, works for software authors, resellers, but also on customer side. So I've got the sort of rounded experience of knowing what both sides want. So yeah, no, thanks for having me.
Of course. So great background. Obviously, you are super qualified to speak on this topic because you have done for 20 years now?
Yeah.
So it's going to be really exciting. So now, we have one of these standard questions before we dig into your stories and the examples of the work that you have done. And that fixed question is going to be your perspective on business growth, Richard.
Okay, so with business growth, I mean, obviously talking about systems as well, different business sizes need systems that it will evolve over time. Now, when you get to a certain size, then you're going to have a system you need to evolve to. And that might include an exercise of data migration as well. Clearly, you might have a very simple, maybe single currency system initially, and then you need to grow to a system that's multi-currency. So that will involve a new system typically and a big data migration project potentially. So yeah, that'd be my perspective on that, Sam.
Okay, very interesting perspective. And by the way, very interesting layer there as well. So when I think of data migration, I was personally not thinking that, there could be a single currency system to your multi-currency. So I want you to provide, if you have any sort of example or the story, I don't know whether you did that or if you have ideas about how to migrate from single currency to multi-currency and what are the challenges that these businesses might expect when they are doing that. So first, obviously, describe the single currency versus multi-currency and what are different challenges that companies might expect. And then also some companies, what they are going to do is they might be multi-currency, but they might be using single currencies. So obviously, they are going to be doing a lot of workarounds in accommodating the multi-currency functionality inside your single currency system. And then you have to migrate all of those workarounds. And typically, that is going to be far more challenging project because you are translating the creativity that these people may have done, and everybody sort of is going to be creative in different fashion, right? So number one, single currency versus multi-currency. Any examples, the story, and the whole data migration for this specific use?
So I think in terms of single currency systems, there's probably not many out there anymore because everyone's, the pennies dropped that everyone transacts in multiple currencies. But all systems have typically, they've got your transaction currency. So you're going to be transacting maybe just a single currency. You might just be in the UK transacting in sterling and reporting in sterling. So it might be a multi-currency system, but as you say, using it as a single currency. In that case, it's going to be, and they might do adjustments when there's, manual adjustments for multi-currency, maybe taking it outside into Excel and then doing, the translation there. Using rates off of whatever site. So that would be, it's a very simple system. But in that case, when you've got those multi-currency with the adjustments, they're going to need to be flagged somewhere as well. So that if you do go to a true multi-currency system, you've got the ability to translate those so that you're always maintaining that record. The reported numbers are always going to be the same in your source system and your new system as well. So that, I don't have specific examples of systems, but that would be an example of how you approach that.
Okay, very interesting. So I don't know how many people are really going to understand what is the difference between your transactional currency. Obviously, CFOs may have big idea from the accounting perspective. But when we look at these ERP systems, they are going to have many different currencies. And multi-currency could mean a lot of different things in many different systems. Some systems are going to claim that they are multi-currency, but they are barely going to have the multi-currency. And when you look at, multiple entities in the ERP world, that could drive the multi-currency functionality. So maybe provide some more layers about how many different currency types are there in the ERP system and what is the transactional currency in the context of the business model. Maybe describe a transaction about where this whole transactional currency is going to be applicable.
Sure. So, I touched on working for software authors. So I worked for Infor back in 2004 for 3 years on Sun Systems. Now, Sun Systems has three main currencies, I'd say. It's got the transaction currency. So that's the currency that you are buying and selling, essentially. So you might buy something in dollars, euros, sterling, whatever it is. So that's your transaction currency, and that is always going to be variable. You'll have multiple transaction currencies in your system. You'll then typically have a base currency or the functional currency. So that's what you're reporting in. In the oil and gas industry that I've been working in for a long time, that's typically US dollars, because US dollars, dollars, the price of oil is always in dollars. So that's typically the functional currency. Then you might have a second base currency or a reporting currency. Now that's the one that if you potentially got statutory reporting in some of your entities, then you would use that as well. So that's three currencies, and they're the three that you typically use in Sun. Sun Systems also has another two, actually. So it has up to 5 in total. You have a variable fourth currency. So for some entities, you can have another currency as well. And then the fifth one is also, that gives you the ability to have a fifth currency as well. I don't know. I never saw the fifth one being used, but I'm sure there's some people out there. Otherwise, it would never have got into the system.
So which one is the fifth one? Do you have some sort of example there of the fifth one? So, so 4 I got. One is obviously your transactional. The second is base, the third is reporting, I guess you mentioned. And fourth is going to be if your entities are going to be reporting in different currency. So you have that. Which is the fifth one?
Correct. So the fifth one just gives you the ability. It doesn't really have a name. It would be if you just had, I'm guessing there's some customer out there who's had the need for a fifth currency at some point, and that's got factored into the system. I'm not sure of any other systems that have up to 5 currencies.
Interesting. Very interesting. So, so let's go back to the data migration aspect. Let's say if a customer implemented a system and they probably didn't understand how to use this currency. Maybe they did the ERP implementation more in the DIY mode. And you know how that goes, right? See, you do whatever you can, but there are going to be at least million ways of doing things in the ERP system. They did it. Now they are trying to transfer it. And now the people who are going to be doing data migration, it's probably a nightmare for them because it's not the intended way of doing things. And if you don't do that, obviously your data migration is going to be far more complex. So what would be the data migration challenges in your experience?
So there can be many. So obviously you need to know your data.
Yeah.
That's one of the absolute key challenges that you have. If you don't understand the structure of your source and target system, then it's going to be problematic, to say the least. You need to understand how the data is structured in the source system, if it's using multi-currency, how it translates the transaction currency to those currencies as well. Does it multiply the rate? Does it divide the rate? It's really getting into the weeds of how those systems work. And if you don't know that from the start, then as I mentioned, that it is going to cause you issues. So you might need to get a specialist from both the source and the target system in for that project. So that would be the first thing that I'd say. Definitely, knowing the data. Also, when you are moving it from one system to the other, there might be certain rules in place that you need to do. There might be missing data from the source that isn't even available in the target.
Yeah.
So you may need to actually work out what the data is going to look like once you do it on a subset of the data, and then maybe apply certain rules. You might need lookup tables, etc.
Yeah.
So that's just a couple of the issues that I would say. There's also things about reconciling the data at every single point. If you're making changes throughout that journey of that data going from source to target, then you need to be reconciling at every point. So if there is a reconciling difference, at what point it's has caused that issue. So that's just a few, Sam.
Yeah. So very interestingly, let's say if I am trying to do this data migration, and again, based on the way you are describing, it probably does not sound as complex, right? Because if you think from my perspective, let's say if I'm the CFO of the manufacturing organization, I grew up doing data reconciliation, data migration. I do the analysis on a daily basis. The amount of analysis that I'm going to be doing for my business, I don't think anybody would be doing as much analysis of my business. They would require some sort of training of my business. I'm probably more qualified in doing any sort of migration for my own business just because of the training time. So now you mentioned that, we are trying to bring in these two experts. One is going to be from system one is going to be from system two. And then obviously I need to train them about my business, about my data, and then they are going to be applying a lot of magic there. And that magic, I'm probably far more expert. So why is data migration so difficult when it comes to ERP, when, it is not as difficult if I'm doing data migration in my spreadsheet?
Okay, well, first of all, you talked about spreadsheets. So each system has its challenges. So I'll give you an example that I worked on it was a couple of years ago now, but that was migrating data from Sage to Sun System for an energy company. So Sage, the data is very hard to get out in a meaningful format. Let's say you want everything in a single row that's got everything you could possibly need about a transaction. The description, the date, the period, the transaction currency, all the different amounts that I mentioned. No. So in Sage, what you have is just a very simple list of transactions, but you don't have the transaction currency. You just have the dollar amount. Then there's a separate table. So if you think of Excel, it's going to be another worksheet, a separate worksheet with all the different rates in for each transaction as well. So it keeps it very separate. So the process that we went through, we had to stitch together all that data and also all the different, so it has the concept of sub ledgers as well. So you've got your trade payables, and then you've got another table with all the data in there about all the transactions with your different creditors. So it's an absolute nightmare. And just to try and stitch all that together, I had a developer create a macro in Excel to actually do some of that stitching together of the data, so we could actually piece it all together so that we could then process it and make it in a Sun Systems format that we could import. So by no means was that an easy feat. And it took a long time to perfect that as well. Obviously, with financial data, you need to reconcile to the penny. So you can't have any differences whatsoever. So that process, it was underestimated how long it would take as well. So I think maybe initially we had 10 days for data migration. Those 10 days got blown out of the water, I think. Yeah, I can't remember the total amount in the end, but it was a lot more than 10 days. I'd say it was probably 50, and that might be, that might.
Okay, so here we are talking about a business and you are talking about very specific data set. And when you look at the large ERP system, there are going to be thousands, 10,000s of data sets that you need to migrate. And the more upstream the data is going to be, the more dependencies they are going to have. Again, here we are talking about probably the lowest common denominator overall from the ERP data perspective. Anything that is going to be related to finance is not going to have as much dependency as your, let's say, if you are trying to migrate your sales orders or the purchase orders, they are going to have a lot more dependency on your GL, shipment, financial periods. I'm not trying to suggest that the financial data is not difficult. That is equally difficult as well, but it is not going to have as many dependencies. So here, when you are, and I don't know if you're able to provide some sort of sense in terms of the total time that it took for you to be able to migrate. I don't know whether it was more of 3 months, 6 months, a year. So overall, at this point of time, I don't know if listeners are able to follow along in terms of the volume and the time estimate that they need to make when they are looking for this kind of business. And I don't even know how large this business was and how many transactions that did they have to be able to migrate this. So are you able to provide any more colors there overall from the size of the business and how many data points are we trying to migrate?
Yeah, sure. So in terms of entities, probably talking about 8. I think it was 8 to 10 entities in total. Probably across all of those entities, talking 500,000 transactions.
Okay.
It's not too much. I've seen a lot more than that as well. And the lapse time was more like 6 months because there were other aspects of the project that it wasn't 6 months purely on data migration, but
that
was a lapse time. To give a ballpark on how long it took in total, I would say 3 months of that. Business days, not 12 weeks. Say 12 weeks to do that. Now I think Sage is a different beast. Obviously, there's no database behind it. Well, there is, but you can't hook into it in SQL like you can with some systems where it makes it slightly easier to do that data migration. So that's a bit of an extreme case. In some way, you've got a bit more of a structured data set, as I mentioned, or you can even extract it into an Excel format with all the data without having to do the stitching together I mentioned. That time frame could come down considerably, down to maybe 6 weeks if you know the data source and target, you know what you're doing, then that time frame could come down.
Okay, so that's a very interesting example right there. So there are a couple of more things that I would like to peel here. So number one, obviously Sage has a lot of different products, and I don't know which product we are talking about. There are going to be some Sage products that are going to be SQL Server based, some sort of SQL technology based. So here, I don't know whether we are talking about Sage 100, 200, 300. I believe those are probably going to be the ones that are going to have your file-based database. Do you recall by any chance which system are we talking about here?
No, but it was one of the more, the lower tier.
Baby ones.
yeah, exactly. The baby ones. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay,
we were
so
migrating to a grown-up system. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So very interesting. So now I think one of the key point that you mentioned there, let's say if you are migrating from slightly more SQL-centric data base to SQL Server-centric database, then your migration is going to be easier because they are probably going to have similar correlation. And a lot of customers, to be honest, they fall for systems that are going to have very different data, very different data model overall. So, so obviously I want your opinion. Do you see this as more effort in terms of data migration? And I don't know, how much effort are we talking about in terms of data migration? But we have seen scenarios where the systems are going to flatten with the data. And the reason why they flatten the data is because the hierarchical data structure that you're going to have, maybe their databases are not as robust. Sometimes they are going to have NoSQL database. Can you believe this? And NoSQL, you are not going to have the same sort of relatability that you are going to have in your mainstream ERP system. So basically, when you mentioned that, when you are going to have different data stores, then your data migration is going to be far more difficult. So do you have any other commentary to add there? Overall, do you see this as a risk when you are going to be migrating, let's say, from NoSQL or other file-based systems to a SQL Server-based system?
I would say when you've got a proprietary database and you're migrating to a structured one like SQL,
Yeah.
that is going to cause you not necessarily more problems. It's going to take you longer.
Yeah.
Okay. If you're doing SQL to SQL, then it's going to be a lot easier, and you could probably use an ETL tool in the middle to unify that data, cleanse it, and then push it into the target system. Another consideration here, though, is with most SaaS-based systems now, you don't have access to the database, so
exactly.
You're really dependent on getting that data out through maybe reports or maybe Excel-based add-ins where you can extract the data. But then pushing it back in, you're also going to be reliant on the target system having an import tool. But often that will give you the ability to do the mapping, maybe some transformation. So I think it should be easier the more applications develop. And if you're doing SaaS to SaaS, then potentially there's going to be a bit more work getting the data out, but then pushing them in. There's often import tools from the initial data migration that happens when you load data into the system. So yeah, there's hopefully that answers the question, Sam.
It does, but I'm obviously interested in some more details there to paint the story for our listeners. So here we are talking about 500,000 transactions, and some people might be confused overall whether this is more of the historical data, is it more of the open PO data, open sales order data, open vouchers, which data set are we talking about? Is it the master data? What exactly are we talking about in terms of migration?
So in that instance, it was the ledger, the general ledger. So purely financial transactions, no open order, no open items on POs or anything like that. It was purely financial data. There's obviously the option to just bring over opening balances, apart from the open item accounts, such as trade payables, etc. But we brought over all the history as well, because it was a relatively young company. I mentioned at the time it would have been maybe 7 years old, the company.
Yeah.
The option, we wanted to bring over everything. So if it was, if you were talking maybe 15 years worth of transactions, you might only bring over the last 7 or however many you want to bring over. And then what you do is then obviously bring over the opening balances for the accounts where you are basically summarizing that data to a point in time.
Okay, so very interesting. So first, I would like to understand the rationale for bringing just the financial data, and I don't know if this was more of the regulatory reasons because of which they really wanted to bring that data, right? But typically, when you are talking about historical data, it's typically going to be your salespeople who are going to be excited about that because they want to look at the customer history, whatever the customers have done. So they are looking at every single sales order, pricing, at what price anybody has bought. Those are the details that they are really interested in. So number one, what was the rationale behind bringing the historical data? Were there any sort of business use cases that drove the reasoning for bringing the historical data?
So the first one, the historical data, the business wanted to just bring everything over. So that was just, very clear. That's what we were doing, bringing everything over.
Okay.
In terms of why was there only financial data, that's because they weren't putting any purchase orders or anything into Sage. So everything was manual in terms of purchase. And then it was just a resulting invoice that was being input into the system. But I have worked on migrations where we have brought over purchase orders on systems as well. In those instances, you can it can get messy, because if you're going to bring over just open items, then it looks a bit weird when you're looking at a purchase order in the target system, because it doesn't match the original one, because there's 10 lines on the original PO. When you migrate, there were only 3 that were open. So you're migrating a PO with 3 items on. and they're just the remaining ones that are to be delivered and invoiced. So there are issues with that. You could bring everything over as well. So if you've got a purchase order and it's still got some open items on it, you could bring over all the items into the new system, but then you need to go through the process of closing off the ones that have already been closed off, just so it gives you a like for like match between source and targets. So I would say migrating purchase order data is a lot more complex than financial data. There's a lot more, as you mentioned earlier, a lot more dependencies involved in the process.
Right. So even in the case of financial data, obviously, the more dependencies you are going to have, the it's going to be a nightmare, to be honest. Okay, and I really don't know why anybody would do that, to be honest. At least in the ERP system, you can build your data warehouse. That's not going to have as tight relatability as your ERP system is going to have. Because in the case of ERP system, you need to close the books, you need to close the financial period, and you literally need to mimic the process of last 15 years. And you are probably doing that manually, because I don't know if there is an automated system that can literally take every single data point and close each of the transaction, for 15 years. That could be a giant software in itself if you were to sort of automate that process. So describe the process. So for example, let's say even if you're bringing the financial data, right? So you first need to create your financial calendar. You need to have them open. Then you are looking at the chart of accounts. There may have been some sort of evolution overall in terms of chart of accounts as well. So you need to make sure your chart of accounts are going to be consistent. Then I don't know if you had to bring in any other dependencies such as your payment terms. At the GL level, probably you don't have all of that complexity. So at the GL level, the only thing you are going to have is your debit, credit, and the currency and the amount, probably, right? Did you have to figure out any other dependencies there, or are we talking about just these 4 or 5 things?
Yeah, absolutely. You've mentioned chart of accounts there. So there was a mapping table between source and target. So in some instances, that's consolidation of accounts where you've got multiple source accounts going into a single target, because we've got a slightly more refined chart of accounts rather than a plethora of ones that have just been created as and when they've been required in the source. So that was one thing. The chart of account mapping is key to getting that right as well, and that includes mapping supplier accounts as well. So in some instances, it might be an option to tidy up supplier accounts. Let's say you've got 2 suppliers, supplier codes for the same supplier, but for some reason they've both been used. You want to tidy that up and just bring it into a single supplier in the target system. That will be done all through the mapping table as well. So it is an option to do that, and actually it's an opportunity, I would say, to actually improve the data set. There's no point in having garbage in the old system and garbage in the new one. You may as well try and clean it up whilst you're going through that migration process, because it takes long enough. So you may as well take the opportunity to have a cleaner data set at the end of it. Also, we had so in Sage there is the option for analysis on transactions, so recording the cost center, the project code, etc. But it hadn't been used. So what we wanted to do is actually bring that across. So we had the finance team identify transactions, and often it was based on suppliers. So they'd know a particular supplier was always going to be related to project A. So then there are almost a set of assumptions as well that were built into the data migration process to say, well, if it's this supplier, then let's code it to project A in the target system. So by what we had in the target system, we were able to analyze the data set, the same transactions, but we were able to analyze them much deeper than just looking at it by supplier, because we could break it down by project, cost center. There are other, also tax as well. So if a transaction had, we could work out based on transaction amounts and certain rules what the rate of VAT was, for example. So then we could code that in, which makes it easier for tax returns as well in the new system. So we managed to improve the data set through assumptions and rules that were validated from source to target.
Yeah, so some very interesting layers there, and I want some more clarifications there. So you mentioned the suppliers having, each of them having an account. So now there are many different ways of sort of setting up your chart of account. If you are going to have 200,000 suppliers, you don't want to have 200,000 chart of accounts. You probably want to have 5 or 6, depending upon what are the categories for your suppliers. Now, if your existing or the legacy system is going to be keeping just one chart of account because of some weird limitation that they cannot probably have the categories, so each of the suppliers is probably going to have one chart of account. So now, again, going back to your example about garbage in, garbage out, if you are going to be bringing the historical data, my assumption is going to be that because of the historical data, you are actually bringing a lot of mess in the new system, and that is going to be polluting the sort of the master data structure even for your new system, because you have to bring a lot of data that is no longer required for your company. So again, I'm going back to my question, whether is it really worth bringing the historical data? Is there any sort of value? But I know that your business said, you know what, we are doing it, no questions.
Yeah, so I think, well, actually, you mentioned that you wouldn't create a chart of account for every supplier. In some systems, you do. You do actually have an account for every single supplier.
Really? Oh,
So,
wow.
yes, yeah, you do. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
So you
Okay.
can have thousands of accounts. It has a separate supplier table which elaborates on that, and that has the payment terms, supplier address, etc. But yes, you do. Whereas in Sage, you just have the trade creditors accounts, but then you have all the supplier codes that are linked through. So it almost has that sub ledger
Yeah.
where the transactions for that are held. So we actually had to create all those new suppliers in the target system. So really, it was just based on the rules by that system. In this case, under the target. In terms of the garbage in, garbage out, yeah, I mean, in the historical data, I think in this case, it's because there was a lot of open transactions as well.
Yeah.
It was very hard to actually determine what was open from the data set that we'd been given out of Sage. It's just we took the lowest risk approach and said, right, bring it all over. It might take a bit more work, but at least we know we've got the data in both systems. We can easily reconcile it, and could potentially do a tidy up at a later date and close off any suppliers that got zero balance haven't been used for a period of time, close those off, etc. So a bit of maintenance afterwards as well.
Yeah, exactly. And you mentioned one more layer there overall in terms of the project. Now, project could mean a lot of different things. Sometimes the project is going to be just a dimension on your GL, and could also be a giant wrapper where you are going to have the operational workflow of your project included. In that, you are going to have the operational task, the budgetary task. There's going to be a little bit of planning. Then you are going to have the suppliers associated with those projects. So my assumption in this particular case is going to be that you simply brought in the dimension which only classifies, okay, which GL belong to which project, and that is the only thing you are bringing. You are not necessarily bringing the whole project object, because that could be far more complex to bring from the historical data perspective. Am I accurate, not accurate here?
Yeah, correct. So in that case, it was just an analysis dimension that you're essentially, bringing in. There's not anything else associated with that project other than a code in it.
Okay. So other than multi-currency, what other challenges can you recall that you may have experienced? You might have any sort of, recommendation for our listeners when they might be planning, let's say, for the data migration project. It could feel overwhelming when you are sort of starting on that task. So what would be your process for the, data migration project? Let's say if somebody is starting fresh.
So first of all, work out what your current currency structure is in terms of, we touched on the different currencies earlier. Yeah. So and then work out what's possible in the new system and how you want it to work. Just another example. So I did a lot of work in Africa for African companies. So you have in Western Africa, you have OHADA accounting, and that's statutory reporting that you have to submit. So you'd have your transaction currency, your US dollar base or functional currency, and then you'd have your other or second base could be West African francs, for example, for your OHADA accounting. So you have to think that every single transaction that's going through is going to create, off of a GBP transaction, is going to create you a US dollar equivalent, and then also a West African franc as well. So it's thinking about, you have to keep that up to date as well, because with your multi-currency systems, you will want to revalue your base currency at the end of every month. It's part of your ledger evaluation process. So taking your foreign currency and seeing what the US dollar amount is at the end of the month, not when that transaction was recorded, but at the end of the month. You also need to do the same thing for your reporting currency as well if you want to keep it up to date. So that's something that you have to consider, and how you're going to produce that set of books when the statute. Often with OHADA, it's not as frequent as IFRS, for reporting, maybe once, twice a year. But you have to keep on top of that, and you have to think about right at the offset how you're going to do that and what you're going to need to report in terms of multi-currency. So it's very important where you're going to get your rates from as well. Yeah. And where it has to calculate it from. So are we calculating it from the transaction currency, or are we actually calculating it from, are we calculating that West African franc amount from the transaction, or from the dollar amount from the functional currency? And I'm sure the accountants in the audience will know better where to do that, but they're the sort of questions that you need to think about as well.
Yeah, so very interesting. And the rate is very challenging part as well when you are looking at the historical data, because let's say if we are going to be translating based on today's rate, the rate has already changed, and then, it's probably not going to reconcile. So I don't know what you had to do to figure out, okay, what was the rate at that moment in that period? And I don't know whether they were closing their books every month for last 15 years. So I don't know if you had to close the books for every month for last 15 years, or were you doing just the 15 period?
So at that point in time for that migration, we were just looking at the transaction dollar, and I think we did actually create the West African franc amount, but clearly that wasn't in the source system. It was just the transaction in the base. So in terms of the rate, yes, what you have to, for OHADA as well, it's often pegged to the euro. So it adds more complexity, because you have to go and find out what the rate to the euro to the West African franc was at that date, and then do some kind of triangulation between the current date, the US dollar amount, and the ZOF. So yeah, it wasn't simple, put it that way, but it's not something I'd like to repeat again too soon. That particular scenario.
Exactly. I mean, I don't want to be part of that project either, to be honest. Okay, any historical migration, it's not fun. It's really not worth it, to be honest. So, all right. I mean, that's it for today. Do you have any last minute closing advice or remarks for our listeners by any chance?
I would say just the 5 things I've got is know your data, reconcile at every stage, take the opportunity to cleanse the data, verify and validate. Then do it again, and do it again. It's financial data, so it's got to be right. And work it on a sample set, something that's representative of your organization, whether it's a quarter, half year, or just a single period. That would be it, Sam. Go into a lot more detail, but I think those sort of 5 points would help.
Okay, amazing insights. And my personal takeaway from this conversation is going to be, if you are going to go through the historical data migration process, make sure you have at least 6 months allocated for that, because I don't think you'll be able to finish before that. And if you're going to be planning yourself in, let's say, 10 days, you are probably going to lose your credibility with your executive. So make sure you are going to be realistic with the expectation overall with your team as well as with your executive team. On that note, I really want to thank you for your time. This has been a powerful episode.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot, Sam. Take care.
I cannot thank our guests enough for coming on the show, for sharing their knowledge and journey. I always pick up learnings from our guests, and hopefully you learned something new today. If you would like to learn more about Richard, follow and connect with him on LinkedIn. Links and more information will also be available in the show notes. If anything in this podcast resonated with you and your business, you might want to check other related episodes, including the interview with Jim Downs, who shares his insights into the importance of tracking meaningful financial KPIs to improve profitability and growth for CPG companies. Also, the interview with Augustin Cruz Lorano, who shares his insights into the taxation and localization nuances of Mexico and why the vanilla ERP would fall short for Mexico. Also, don't forget to subscribe and spread the word among folks with similar backgrounds. If you have any questions or comments about the show, please review and rate us on your favorite podcasting platform or DM me on any social channels. I'll try my best to respond personally and make sure you get help. Thank you, and I hope to catch you on on the next episode of the WBS Podcast.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the WBS Podcast. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcasting platform so you never miss an episode. For more information on growth strategies for SMBs using ERP and digital transformation, check out our community at WBS.rocks. We'll see you next time.